Every time I do this, the needle moves my company. Every time. So how do you scale and how do you know what to scale? This is where we take this concept and then we have the double Pareto. But the problem with that is when you're doing that, your base costs are going up, but then so is your revenue. And it'll get to a point where you're making double the revenue, but how come the profit's not as much? What is the top 4% that moves and gets 96% of the results? That's where we want to focus. They say that if you want to go fast, go by yourself. If you want to go far, go together. If you want to go fast and far, get a mentor, right? So when we're scaling, you have to know which part to scale and which part of your business lacks. So for example, how do you scale? You either scale through people or you scale through tech, one of the two or both. How many of you right now have a number 2 in your company? So if you don't have a number 1 or a number 2, it's going to be very hard for you to scale. How many of you have an operations person in your company? So those of you who have operations, if you don't, this is the one thing that's stopping from scaling. Why? Because you're trying to do everything yourself. If you're trying to do everything yourself, there's only so many balls you can juggle at any one time. When I think about scaling, you want to look for the leverage points, right? So where are the leverage points in your business? Have you heard of the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle? So the 80-20 rule, it states, 20% of the world owns 80% of the wealth, right? Out of all the clothes in your wardrobe, right? You'll wear 80% of the same clothes and 20% not. From your paycheck that you get, 80% goes onto bills, 20% gets saved or spent, right? From the rooms that you use in your house, 80% of the rooms in your house, 20%. So that's the kind of put a rule to generalize how things are, right? So this is the Pareto rule, 80-20 rule. So how do you scale and how do you know what to scale? This is where we take this concept and then we have the double Pareto. Everyone talks about 80-20, but no one ever talks about the double Pareto. The double Pareto is the 20% of the 20%, which is your top 4%. This is why a lot of people, when they try and do things by themselves, they're doing things which is not in their top 4%. So the question is, what is the top 4% that moves and gets 96% of the results? That's where we want to focus. And you have to be careful when you're in this method, when you're scaling a company, because what I generally find is when you scale the company, you need to hire more people, or you need to hire more tech, or you need to upskill yourself in some area. But the problem with that is when you're doing that, it means your base costs are going up, yes or no? Your base costs are going up, but then so is your revenue. And they'll get to a point where you're making double the revenue, but how come the profit's not as much? I doubled my cost. So let's say you're spending 100,000 a month, and then you're now spending 200,000 a month. Let's say you're making $1 million, right? And now you're making 2 million because of that. But yet your profit is like only 150. It should be 2 million, but it's like 1.5. Why is my profit not scaling with my costs? So what happens is when you scale the company, sometimes your revenue does, when you do that, your revenue does go up, but then your profit doesn't go up in the same way. And then the danger is when the sales stop coming in, you're still stuck with the costs. You know what I'm saying? So what happens is now you stick with the cost, then you have to start letting people go. So actually one of the best ways to scale is to scale organically first until you reach critical mass. So what I think about is, okay, based on all the things that I'm doing right now, what are the top 4 things or top 4% of things that I do that move the needle? Well, I've actually put it into a formula. It's called the SPEC formula. This is what I focus on almost every day. SPEC. So stages, podcasts, events, and collaborations. Every time I do this, the needle moves my company. Every time. That's why I run 200 events a year. Because when you have distribution, you have visibility. I find that when I'm on a stage, every time I get off a stage, I always get people pitching me ideas. John, I got this deck. John, I've got a startup. John, I want to do this, John, right? So instead of me going to knock on other people's doors, everyone's knocking on my door. So the stages create positioning, right? It's like if you have to call somebody up and try and pitch them, it's different to someone calling me and pitching me. So not only that, it creates credibility as well. That's why I always like to speak on big stages all around the world. right? Which I just did South Africa, like 3,000 people, right? So you want to also be international as well. So you understand culture. It's not just one part in one place. Podcasts. Why is podcast important? Because podcasts, I go to other people's networks. In fact, tonight, I want you to, I'll get Brian to send a podcast that I did. I'm telling you, that one podcast made me over $10 million. One podcast. One. And still till today makes me money. In fact, when you do this, you can't stop the money from coming in. Is that a good position to be in? Yes or no? Right? So everywhere I go, so for example, we were just in Toronto. I went to Toronto, I did a podcast on stage. As soon as I got off stage, I had about 5 people picturing, oh, John, I got a podcast. When are you flying now? You're flying. They say, okay, can you do a podcast? So then Kirk and I, we had to take a car all the way to like 30 minutes out, do podcast, and then all the way back. But that's going to go to all the top real estate agents in Toronto now. So if I want to buy property in Toronto now, I already have base. You see, here's another thing. If people don't know who you are, they listen to your podcast, they get to know who you are. By the way, how many of you do podcasts on a regular basis? Okay, you should be aiming for 1 a week minimum. Any podcast. Technically, it should be a podcast in your niche. But sometimes it'd be strange. Like I do podcast to health podcasts. I don't really know that much about, I mean, I'm on my journey, so I've got this. Anyone wear Whoop? Well, here's the thing, right? You know, I'm all into optimizing, right? And the day before, I checked my Whoop, it was at 11%. And there's a direct correlation between how much sleep that you get, based on how much strain you get, based on how much stress you get, based on your HRV. So all these numbers, if they optimize somewhere, you perform better. You have more thought process, you're cognitive, you think faster. And anyway, as entrepreneurs and CEOs of our company, every decision we make important, yes or no? Yes. If you're the CEO of your company, you have to make strong, fast, quick decisions. So that's why I noticed that when I get below 6 hours sleep, right, versus 7 hours, 8 hours, I've not reached 9 hours yet, I'm getting close. My performance is so much better. You see, your health is actually your wealth. When we're young, we sacrifice our health to get the money. When we're sick, we sacrifice all our money to get health. Why don't you just fix your health from the start? The reason I'm talking about this is because when I go to a health audience, I'm talking about health, but I'm not the expert at health. But what happens is in that podcast, some of the people in there are business owners. Then they start reaching out to me. Oh, John, what else are you doing? Well, I've got Ultra Human Ring as well. I've got the Aura Ring and I'm wearing an Apple Watch. Someone says to me the other day, John, how come we don't wear your Rolexes anymore? Well, first of all, you don't go out in London with a Rolex. That's for a start, right? You get mugged. But second of all, this is functional, right? If I'm like, I was carrying loads of stuff the other day. Brian's calling me. I was like, just take the call. Right? So it's more functional. Obviously, if I'm going to like a black tie, then yeah, I'll wear the nice stuff, right? But the point is that I always think about what's going to save me time and optimize my time, because time is the most precious thing, right? Little seconds that you save, minutes that you save. That's why I say don't do $10 jobs, right? You want to scale your company, don't do $10 jobs. Meaning you need to work how much money you're worth per hour. Anything less than your hourly rate, pay someone else to do it. But why don't people do that? Because they don't value the time enough. Right? So one thing I hate doing is like cooking, because I travel a lot. So we had a private chef. So she's called Sue and she makes me, nice breakfast. And now, because think about it, you got to wash the dish, prepare the food. I mean, yeah, okay, in a weekend, that's fine. You want to have some relaxation. But in business week, we got to be focused on what we do because it keeps the momentum, right? Any interruption to the time, right? It just throws you off. How many of you you're just about to sit down and do this project and someone calls you and say, can you do that? And it just sucks up all your time. You never stop. So it's getting focused on the things. And actually, it doesn't cost that much money. In fact, I don't even think about it as a cost. I think of it as an investment. If I can have that person do that for me, it saves me 2 hours in a day. In those 2 hours, I can do a podcast where 1 million people can see it. And I get investors from that. And I get deal flow from that. And I get partnerships and collaborations from that, which leads me to the next part, events. So you should all be speaking at other people's events and putting on your own events. The easiest way to get another stage is to have an own stage. Right? When I first started off in real estate, I would go and speak at these property networking events. So there's a guy called Just One Rye, and he calls me and he's like, hey, John, can you come speak at my event? I said, I'm not a speaker. No, I just heard you spoke at Steve's event. Can you come speak at my event? It's like 250 people there. I didn't know what to say. I wrote because people kept asking me, how do you invest in real estate? So I just wrote a little report and I would just basically give it to people and I'm going to start reading it. But do you know, from that event, the more you speak, the more invitations you get. That's why it's really important, no matter what it is, you should take, if you're starting off, I promise you, as soon as you start talking about what you do, you start attracting your exact target audience. When I look at the C's for your collaboration, so I scale through collaboration. Here's the thing, in business, people say, John, why do you run these masterminds? Why do you run these events? My goal is to maybe, depending on what business you're in, I want to find more Morello Sulis. I want to find people who are smart, who they do whatever it takes. They don't BS, they don't complain, they take action. And when you get to that point, we scale together. You know, one of the biggest mistakes that I made is working 15 years for one company. Well, when I should have done, spending 15 years working with 1,000 companies. That's my goal, actually. I want to get to 1,000 companies. Because if I can take a little bit of my know-how, take the 4% and just go, boop, 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 that's like 20 companies you can pick up. It's leverage, isn't it? That's the top 4%. Actually, you don't want to be the CEO. I want to let someone else be the CEO. Let them do the job, direct them, make them more money. And in exchange, I got to cut from it. That's called working smart.